being in Prague, and we were, at least I and a couple of other colleagues were put up in the hotel which is called Adler. And this morning I looked around the walls, and there are all these wonderful monuments, not monuments, but wonderful portraits of some monuments of Berkeley, mostly portraits and maps. It's clearly nostalgia about the lost paradise of the Austria-Hungary. And there is a statement that, well, before 1938, more than 30% of population of Bohemia spoke German. And I thought, well, it's interesting that we in Ukraine and you here in Czech Republic are in very different places in terms of relationship to your empires. To our empires. Again, imagining something like that, celebration of the empire, nostalgia for the Russian Empire today, in Kiev especially today, would be almost impossible. But the Czechs are secure enough to talk about more than 30% speaking German, and actually looking at the cultural and otherwise positive thing that came here in Prague as a result of cooperation between different national groups. So there are differences, but there are also a lot in common. And what is in common when it comes to the two states and the two national projects is that we came out, more or less out of the same intellectual and cultural process, of the formation and understanding what the Slavs are, and then the process of actually redrawing this map of the Slav zone, finding place for ourselves, and place linguistically, place culturally, and then places politically in terms of the borders that we were drawing. And think about, again, there are differences, but there are similarities. It's only by 92 the Czech Republic is being established with its current borders. Till then, there is still a search and still debate and still trying to configure what that means. In Ukraine, the process of configuration is still going on. It's a different kind, but again, there are the general, in terms of general trends, there is a commonality, and the question is, what is our relation to other Slavs, our neighboring Slavs? Whether we are part of a one bigger world, and again, that was Putin's proposition in Ukraine in 2013 with the Ruski Mir, or we are maybe somehow connected, but we are still separate, and that means that we are more comfortable not just as an autonomous unit, but as an independent unit. And this is very much the general framework, the general background against which I will be discussing our today's topic. And this is about Ukraine and the fall, the collapse of the pan-Russian idea. What is pan-Russian idea? It's the idea that was certainly dominant in the Russian Empire before 1917. The idea that there exists a big Russian nation that includes different branches, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, but basically this is the same people. And that is the kind of idea that again Putin repeats again and again in 2013 and 2014. Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. It's intellectually, it goes back to pre-1917's Russian Empire, and it is that particular idea that I look at how it developed, how it came to existence, and what happened to it in the process of the World War I, and then the revolution and the formation of independent Ukrainian state, and then later the collapse of that state and creation of the Soviet Union. Because again, if you think that there was a Ukrainian state for a short period of time, it collapsed and there was no impact, no influence on what happens later, it's wrong, because again, it influenced, the state didn't survive itself, but the idea was powerful enough to influence that whatever culture, whatever state, whatever legal models came to replace it, it already took into account that the revolutionary change of 1916, 1917. So, I will originally start we'll say a few words about the events that are especially close to us today. That's the events of World War I. And then from there I will go back into the medieval times and look at the origins of that idea, and we will then progress more or less chronologically from there. The opening will be related to World War I, and partially because, again, it would be difficult to come up with a better dates and timing for the conference. I know that there was negotiation going back and forth, but today and tomorrow we are marking the 100-year anniversary of the end of World War I. And there is huge literature, as those of you who are historians know, there is a huge, just enormous literature on the World War I. And one of the big questions that is being discussed is what was the reason for the start of World War I, what led to it. There is a very influential book, it's a quite old book, but quite influential, by Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August, so that it was all mistake. There are other people who write about that and say the division of the world into two camps. That is one of the reasons. Lenin had his own explanation. It's imperialism that is there in action, and it leads to the beginning of the war. But I want to say that World War I starts as the war of the empires, but it ends as with the victory, with the defeat of the empires as such, and the victory of the nation state. And in that sense, when we look at the very beginning of the Cold War with World War I, with Gavrilo Princip and with the assassination in Sarajevo, you kind of already see that the template for what is happening and where it would lead, because after Austria-Hungary goes against Serbia. Why? Because it's afraid of the rising Slavic nationalism within its borders. So the idea is to crush the outside power that can actually incite that nationalism and support it. So the war starts with the weakened empire trying to crush this new power of nationalism, and not just any nationalism, Slavic nationalism. And how it goes from there, that's the map of the world before 1914, and the borders of the new states, how they emerge. How it goes from there, it depends. Some Slavic nations actually are lucky enough to create their own states. Others, like Ukraine, try to create once, a couple of times, at least in the Ukrainian case, in 1918. There are two declarations of Ukrainian independence in the east of the country and in the west of the country, but eventually don't succeed. So the world after World War I, when it comes to the Slavic part of it, is very interesting in the sense that there is the emergence of the Slavic states that were not there before. So Poland is being recreated, Czechoslovakia is being created. We are talking about Yugoslavia. But the relationship between these different groups and nations is still not defined. It will take the rest of the 20th century to figure out eventually where the borders should be or not be. And from that point of view, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the split of Czechs and Slovaks, the war in the Balkans, it's all the part of the same story, the story of the 20th century in the Slavic world that starts in Sarajevo with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. So you see Czechoslovakia, in which the Czechs are in the driving seat, and there are two other Slavic groups. You see Poland, where the Poland is being reborn, but there are also big Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities, and the relationship between them are not happy at all. So there is a conflict within the Slavic states itself, and there is this arrangement of Yugoslavia. So that brings me to, again, that's something to keep in mind as a framework. We'll come back to that, but I now, after this general introduction, would like to switch to the idea, to the theme that is at the focus of my presentation, and this is this pan-Russian nation, the big Russian nation. When Putin today speaks about Ukrainians and Russians being one and the same nation, The idea is that this nation is being born in Kievan Rus. It shares the same founder, which you can see here. It's Saint Volodymyr. It shares the same religion. It shares the same literary language. And in that sense, that's the nation that was born really at the very beginning, at the origins of the East Slavic history, and it's a legitimate entity that should exist in one way or another today. Well, that wasn't always the case in Moscow, certainly during the Middle Ages. The rediscovery of Kiev happens in Moscow really in the 14th century, in the process of their quote-unquote liberation from the Mongol rule. Around that time, the Russian, at that time, Grand Dukes, Muscovite Grand Dukes, start to the process that Vasily Khrushchevsky, one of the leading Russian historians of the early 20th century, called the gathering of the Rus lands. And the biggest challenge for them is Novgorod. And there is a war for Novgorod. And there is a need to explain why there is the legitimate claim on the part of Moscow for Novgorod. And that's where Kiev becomes important. That's where the theory is built that, okay, we have the right for Novgorod because we are the continuation of the Rurikite tradition. We are really the legitimate heirs to the Kievan throne. So it's the part of the rise of Russia as an independent state in the 14th century right away immediately is closely connected to the idea of Kievan heritage. So we are rebuilding, we are reconstructing what was lost, which belongs to us, and we are heirs to Kiev. This is the map that shows the geographic expansion of Russia from this dark green color around Moscow. That's the original borders of the Russian state. Then by the beginning of the 17th century, you see this light green color that would include good part of today's central Russia and go all the way to the Ural Mountains. And then by the mid-17th century, the borders are moved to include Kiev. And it is there that a new idea is being born, that Moscow is an heir to Kiev and Kievan princes, not just because there was the question of that Christianity was accepted, or not just because the prince, the founder allegedly of the Rurikite dynasty comes from there. By mid-16th century, there was no Rurikites on the Moscow throne. There are Romanovs anymore. But that's we historians know today. At that time, it was just one straight line. There was no allegedly interruption between those. But the Kievan monks, actually, they bring different set of ideas. They are, by mid-16th century, people like Gizem and other, they are part of a broader world which includes Poland and which includes Italy. The idea of nation or narod in Polish, narod in Ukrainian, in Czech it will be narod, okay? So it is already there. So a new entity is being born, right? It's not dynasty, it's not monarchy, it's not the ruler, loyalty to the ruler, it's not the church, it's narod. And those monks in the Kievan monastery, they already think in those terms. And they're threatened, they're on the border between the Catholic Poles and the Orthodox Russian Tsars, and they're trying to convince the Tsar that no, we should stay in the Orthodox state. But they make argument not only dynastic, they make arguments not only religious. They make a very interesting argument, which is basically early modern national argument. We should be with you because we are all part of the same nation. The so-called Slovo-Russian narod, the Sloveno-Ruski narod. This This is one of the key elements that comes in the second half of the 16th century with the publication of Synopsis in Kiev. Synopsis becomes the first printed textbook of quote-unquote Russian or East Slavic history in the Russian Empire. So the product of the Kievan monks, that okay, we are not just have history, but we are part of the same nation, becomes the first textbook in history that anybody educated group in the Russian Empire as a whole is holding. So by the beginning, in Russia they originally don't understand really what is happening. They don't think yet in national terms. It would take them a good part of the 18th century to accept that. I give you one example. The title of the synopsis that was published in Kiev. In the long title, it's kind of a Baroque title, it takes the entire page. You can't tweet it now today, so you need to do that twice or thrice or something like that. It is a long hour. But the key element is there that, okay, the narod is there, the Sloveno-Ruski narod is there. When they start reprinting that in Moscow, in St. Petersburg in particular, at the beginning of the 18th century, the term narod is replaced with the term государство. So the nation is replaced with the state. And state is really central for the Russian thinking, certainly at that time and for a long period after that. So it takes a while, but by the end of the 18th century, they accept this idea. And of course, the people who created it, people in Kiev, become eventually not just the creators of that concept, but hostages to it. That is being realized more or less by the mid 19th century, and that's the time when you start to think about narod in different categories. It's very much about language. Language defines narod, and at the beginning of the 17th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, all these people who go out there and collect folklore and say, wow, you know what? These people around Kiev, they just like speak different language than people around Moscow. What does this mean? Maybe there is no one narod, maybe there is more than one narod. So the language changes understanding of what is nation or what is not nation. When people were speaking in the 17th century about nation, language was not as important, especially the language of the spoken population. But by the mid-19th century, that's the foundation on which you build your nation. The Germans are the first to come with this idea because they don't have a state of their own. Czechs pick up on that. The Poles are there as well, despite the fact that the Poles lost by the end of the 18th century their multi-ethnic state, multi-ethnic empire, so they mix this language with religion and with other things. But those who don't have a state of their own, they jump on the language bandwagon because that's for them. This is the way to go. But how do you define where one language starts, where it ends? It's good if you have a sea or an ocean to divide them, that can help you. But go today in Ukrainian police and try to figure out where there is a border between Ukrainian and Russian. Ukrainian and Belarusian. In Kiev they will say, no, the Brest region is ours because this is really the Ukrainian dialect. And it will be going back and forth, or I don't know, think about I was really shocked at some point when there were elections in Kiev, and at that time President Kuchma was going for the second term, and the reporters went to his native village in the Chernihiv region and interviewed his people from the village. It took me a while to figure out what language they speak. Because I'm coming from southern Ukraine. For me, Surjik, it's not, you can't surprise me with Surjik, I know. But Surjik is a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian that are already quite foreign languages. There in the marshes of the Pripyat, they speak this transitional dialects, the transitional dialects between the three groups, and it's a real challenge. How you use the language map to build nations. Well, and that's where the Czechs come in and try to help us to figure out who is who. And that's the, of course, Paul Shafarczyk. The map is the map of Netherlands, so it's not exactly that map. But by 1843, there is a publication of the book and map by Shafarczyk in the Russian Empire, who says, you know what, guys, there are actually not 5 Russian nations as it was believed and as Pestel and other Decembrists were thinking about. Not 5 or 6, there are 3. There are Great Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians. And people like Ismail Serhii in Kharkiv, another renowned linguist, says, no, this is nonsense. There are only 2 languages and 2 nations, Little Russian and Great Russian. And Belarusians are just part of the Great Russian state, and we don't think that. So people like Shevchenko, people like Kostomarov, the creators of the modern Ukrainian political project, they think that there are two quote-unquote Rus nations. Kostomarov, for those of you who took courses in the Ukrainian universities, wrote the article that was called Две русские национальности, the 2 Rus nationalities. So there was no place in that picture of the East Slavic world for the Belarusians. But Shafarczyk's idea actually became the most influential ones in the Russian Empire, and partially because the people like Pogodin and others in Moscow, they picked up on that idea. For them, it was important to fight off the Polish claims for what is today Belarus. So they were interested for political and other reasons for having Belarusian as a separate group. But what all of that means? Okay, so there is this Slavic world, and the Slavic world is divided into, eventually it becomes known as Eastern Slavs and Western Slavs and Southern Slavs. But what is Eastern Slavs? Well, Shafarczyk believes that these are basically, and especially Netherlands believes and is strongly committed to that this is still one nation. There are dialects, but that still it's the one group. And Netherlands is really very strongly opposed to the idea of the Ukrainian self-identification, completely separate from Russia. Shafarczyk is more ambiguous about that, and again, his data comes from the Ukrainians like Bodyansky and others, because Shafarczyk creates the map never traveling to that land. So it's not like he was going and interviewing people and trying to figure out what suffixes are and what is going on. He didn't have internet at that time, no email, but he corresponded. He corresponded with people like Osip Bodyansky, a Ukrainian from Kharkiv, who was in Moscow, was one of the founders of the Slavic studies at the Moscow University, and really he picked up on things that were already emerging at that time in the Russian Empire. Bodyansky and Nadezhdin and others. Nadezhdin was writing Kapital, was reading Kapital, another major Slavist in Vienna, and they came up with that model. Now, the question is whether this are just dialects or these are languages. And if it's a language, well, by the rules of the 19th century, that means you're already entitled for your own nation. It's not just the question of what word you use. It's a political question. And the first to understand that were, of course, the Russian imperial authorities. So the Valuyev Ukaz 1863 is issued not by the Minister of the Education. It is issued by the Minister of Interior. It's the security question. It's the security issue. 1863, arrest the development of that language because it can become dangerous for the state. And then continuation with the Amsukaz later. So basically the development of the language is arrested for the political reasons because language means nation in the 19th century. And the Russian bureaucrats, they're not stupid, they understand it. And it goes all the way up to 1905. The revolution of 1905 changes that and opens the opportunity for the Ukrainian activists to start publish in Ukraine, including newspapers. The first newspapers appeared, the first scientific publications now in the Russian Empire, not in the Austria-Hungary. In the Austria-Hungary, that could happen earlier, it could happen later. But the fact that by 1905 you can theoretically and practically publish in Ukrainian and sell books, by the way, they try to target peasantry, they try to target villages. And the most popular stuff in Ukrainian that goes there is what we would call today cartoons. So they're basically short books, illustrated books, and mostly humor. So it's a lot of also postcards and things like that. There's a few words in Ukrainian here and there. So it's not. There is already development, certainly a higher literature, but for the population at large, it's quite from our today's point of view primitive text. The reason for that is very simple. If people can write and read in 1905 in the Russian Empire, they were lucky enough to go through the 2 or 4 years of the school where they would be trained in Russian, to write in Russian, to read in Russian, and as a symbol of their uniqueness and separateness, they would be presented with a book by Nikolai Gogol, Taras Bulba. So that would be a recognition that, okay guys, you have also a little bit of your own tradition and your own history, but basically the language in which you study, in which you read, in which you move to the world that opens to you all these possibilities is Russian language. And the revolution of 1905-1907 actually creates a new phenomenon, and that phenomenon is called Russian nationalism. The Tsarist regime survives in the revolution of 1905-1907 because it can mobilize that Russian nationalism. And between 1905 and 1907, once the elections to the Duma, to the first parliament start, do you think the Ukrainian peasants vote for the representatives of the Ukrainian parties? No, they're voting in Volhynia, in Podolye, in other areas for the representatives of the pan-Russian parties. The biggest branch of the Союз Русского Народа, the Russian nationalist organization, is in Volhynia. Not many people speak Russian now there, and even less was spoken back then. But that's the idea that you can speak your little Russian dialect, but you're still Russian and you can be part of the big Russian world. And you're voting for the Союз Русского Народа, and Russian nationalist, anti-Semitic, anti-Ukrainian, anti-Polish, and anti whatever you can add, anti would be there. You vote for that organization. The absolute triumph of the Russian idea, of the pan-Russian nation, comes in March of 1915. In the middle of the World War I. You can Google for the photographs of the announcement of the Russia entering the war in August of 1914, and the crowds that gathered in front of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg when the announcement was made. There are crowds, there is enthusiasm, there is a support, and there are quite a few slogans there. And generally, the war is presented on the Russian side as the epic battle between the Slavdom and between the German race, between the Slavic race and the German race. But there are also parts that there are at least slogans that work with kind of more relevant to our today's topic, and the slogans are there that, well, freedom to the Carpathian Rus, the unity of the Slavic world, So the idea of the reunification of this heritage of the Kievan Rus, and that means Galicia and Transcarpathia and other parts, what Szafrzyk actually puts into the East Slavic realm, despite the fact that Transcarpathia and Galicia are part of Austria-Hungary when he writes. For him, this is all part of this kind of a big East Slavic world and part of the Little Russian dialects. So the Tsars are reading Szafrzyk to a degree, and not just the Tsars, but the population at large. So one of the goals, ideological goals of the Russian Empire in that war is the quote-unquote reunification of the Russian lands, which include Lviv, which include Transcarpathia, which include Peremysl, Przemysl, and of course, with the first successes of the Russian army in 1914, once they move to the Lviv, it becomes not Lemberg anymore, it becomes Lvov. And what they discovered there, that the Galician Ukrainians are also divided. Part of them believe that they're Ukrainians, other part believe that they're part of the big Russian nation, the Moskophiles, so the Russophiles. The Ukrainian branch is actually winning in this battle with the Russophiles, but Russophiles are there, and there is enough of them. Not all of them were arrested by Austrians. Close to 20,000 people were arrested as Russophiles and shipped to Graz in Austria, in one of the first concentration camps in history. But there is enough left there to man the administration, to start the publications, and so on and so forth. So the battle is still about the identity, even in Galicia at that time. And I said that the triumph comes in March 1915, and that's when Nicholas II, against the advice of his military commanders, makes this trip to Lviv and then to Peremysl, and celebrates Orthodox Easter there. The goal of the Russian Tsars, the promise of the monks of the Caves Lava, the legacy of the Kievan Rus is finally here. The Russian bayonet got all the way to the Carpathian Mountains, and the Russian world is now being reunited. The mission is fulfilled. It's March. By May 1915, things turn around. The Germans are moving their divisions to where the Austro-Hungarian army, multi-ethnic, multinational, was not motivated to fight for the empire. The Germans are a nation state. They are a nation state at that time. They are much more mobilized, they are much more united than the multi-ethnic empires. They are pushing the Russian armies back. The collapse of the Russian Empire starts in May 1915. 2 months after this celebration of the unity, in Diary of Nicholas II, he writes, "Wow, it's such a wonderful place. It reminds me about Poltava and other regions." So he understands that the rather kind of cultural continuity. And his sister writes that, okay, that was the moment when I felt that the unity between the Russian people and the monarchy was the strongest. That was happening in the city of Lviv, where nobody spoke Russian at the time. But that was it. After that, what you see is actually the unraveling of the empire and the unraveling of the idea of the big Russian nation. And the key, Nicholas II takes, by the summer of 1915, takes personal command of the army, tries to save the situation, nothing works. He gets into the conflict with the Duma, and the Social Democrats are there, so by 1917 you get a revolution. And the revolution, which is called normally Russian Revolution, happens really in the Russian Empire, which means that it is revolution of not just within Russia, but it's revolution on the margins, on the borders of the empire, where you see the emergence of Georgia, where you see the emergence eventually of the Baltic states, where Ukraine and even Belarus declare their independence in that process. But when it comes to the unity of this so-called Russian world, it's the Ukrainians who create the most problems for that concept, for that idea. And it is in particular Central Rada, and it's in particular Mikhailo Hrushevsky as the leader of the Rada that serves as an ideologue of this new mobilization, in which the provisional government in St. Petersburg is persuaded or threatened into the acceptance of the Central Rada as the legitimate authority on the territory of Ukraine, which is absolute anathema to the supporters of the big Russian idea, to the supporters of the Russian Empire. And it's not that the Central Rada is basically in charge of that, but this is because the provisional government in St. Petersburg recognized Little Russia as a separate entity and recognized the category of Little Russians. And one of the leading Russian nationalists at that time, Vasily Shulgin, who of course was born in Kiev. For those of you who is familiar with the Soviet literature, there is this novel 12 Chairs, 12 Studies, and there is a figure of Kisa Vorobyaninov, the emigre who travels to the Soviet Union and gets this weird haircut, the color is here in a strange color. So all of that is taken from the memoirs of Vasily Shulgin, who was traveling in 1923 and 1924 to Ukraine, and he got his haircut in Kiev. That's the story behind Ilfin and Petrov. But Shulgin is a major figure which allows us to explain a lot about the rise and collapse of the pan-Russian idea in Ukraine. He is born in the family of the publisher of the newspaper Kyiv Granny, which was basically originally half liberal, but then became Russian nationalist mouthpiece there. And he was elected from Volhynia, exactly the place where they voted for the Soyuz Ruskого Naroda. He was one of the key Russian nationalists at that time. He was one of 2 or 3 people who administers the abdiction of Nicholas II in February of 1917, something that opens the door to the revolution, to the 1918. And he is in Kiev, and he publishes this article saying that, well, this is absurd. What Little Russians? Because look at what the population of Kiev reads. It reads overwhelmingly Russian newspapers. So on this basis, they're Russians. There is no foundation for the provisional government to recognize them as anybody else. So the war is going on and the conflict is going on. When General Denikin, the Russian army moves into Ukraine, Vasily Shulgin is there, one of the main ideologues of Denikin. He writes for him Appeal to the Little Russian People, where he makes some concessions. He's saying, okay, guys, you wanted Ukrainian language or Little Russian people, Little Russian language in the schools, we will get that, we'll tolerate that. But in the first 4 classes, to help you to master Russian. Once you went through that process, then actually after the 4th class we switch education into Russian. But we are not against Little Russians, we are not against Little Russian language, but the higher culture should be served by the Russian language. This is Petr Struve, another big liberal at that time. That's his model that was presented to us in 1912. It didn't work. You see revolts in Ukraine. After declaration of the Ukrainian independent state, with the reincarnation of it then under the German control, German and Austro-Hungarian control, the creation of the Directory, which was really came to existence by mobilizing Ukrainians in the villages and mobilizing on the basis of the national idea. The Denikins and the Vasily Shulgin's ideas that okay, you can limit the language to the 4 first grade and then forget about that doesn't work anymore. And it's Vladimir Lenin who is the first to recognize it. In late 1919, when Denikin is defeated, he is writing a series of letters where he is saying, why did we lose Ukraine before that in early 1918? And he says, well, because we didn't pay attention to the nationality question. And in December of 1919, and after that, he basically introduces a different model for the compromise and for the accommodation of the Ukrainians into this big, into the communist-dominated state. And he says that, well, first of all, we have to send to Ukraine people who can speak Ukrainian. Second, we have to actually recruit people on the ground who will be our representatives who will do it. And part of the Ukrainian left socialists, the Serhii, the so-called Borotbisti, eventually joined individually, not as a group, the Russian Communist Party. So all of this in attempt actually to accommodate this new reality. And one more thing is that Lenin never believed, at least by that time, he never believed in the big Russian nation. He has a different ideology. His glue that will keep all these groups together is not language, is not religion, it's communism. It's communist ideology. So he couldn't care less whether the Ukrainians and Belarusians are separate or not, because at the end it's the party and the communist ideology that should keep them together. What that means is that under the Bolsheviks, as the result of this Ukrainian revolt from Central Victoria to Hetmanate and so on and so forth, emerged the reality that those outside powers who don't recognize it, like Denikin, they lose. Those who recognize and try to accommodate, like the Bolsheviks, they win. And the big then battle and debate happens a little bit later in 1922, when Stalin and Lenin are discussing the ways of how should be the new state should be created. The story begins in Genoa at the international conference, where the representatives of the Russian Federation, Chechen, is signing the agreement with the Germans about recognition and establishing diplomatic relations. And he is prepared to sign on the part of all Soviet republics. And then there are two troublemakers, Georgians and Ukrainians, who say, not so fast. We are formally independent states. We are not represented by you. You can sign on the part of Russia. And look at this territory at that time. So all of that is Russia. And that's Ukraine, small Belarus over there, and this is Transcaucasian Confederation at that time. And there are still semi-feudal states of Khiva and so on and so forth. So the Chechen represents this place, and he says, okay, I'm signing on behalf of all of that. These small places are saying, no, we're not doing it. Georgians even don't have their socialist separate republic at that time. They're part of confederation, of the Transcaucasian Federation. And it's at that time that it is decided, okay, we have to do something about that. We have to figure out how to establish the legitimate, what is the role of this republic? So what do we represent? De facto, the state is glued together by the arms, by military, by the rule of the party. But legally, these are separate independent republics. The Bolsheviks had to do that, to give concessions to those nationalities. And it's at that time that two projects emerge of how we will put this together. And one is represented by the People's Commissar of Nationalities, who was Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin says, well, it's very simple. There is a Russian Federation, and we'll give all these small guys the rights of autonomy within the Russian Federation. And again, Ukrainians and Georgians are unhappy with the solution. Stalin sends Orджоникidze to the Caucasus, and he beats up one of the Georgian Bolsheviks. Of course, that Bolshevik is not very happy, so they go and knock on the door of Lenin, who is about to start dying. And Lenin is in the middle of the fight with Stalin, and he says, no, we're not doing that Russian Federation plus autonomies. We are creating a union where all of them are equal. So this is equal to this. Stalin says, absurd. Why create one more layer of bureaucracy? We have Russian Federation, they will be autonomous and will Lenin, with the support of the Ukrainian Bolsheviks, Georgian Bolsheviks, and others, actually wins and creates the structure that eventually helps the process of, at that time, we believe it was peaceful disintegration of the Soviet Union. All of these republics become. Why this happens? Why Stalin's plan was stopped and the plan that was supported by Lenin succeeded? Actually because of that resistance from the national minority. They were Bolsheviks, they were communists, but again, this idea, it's crossed already this ideological divisions and these lines. What does this mean? Well, this means, first of all, that despite all the problems, the states that were created in the middle of the World War I and disintegration of the empire survive pro forma as an independent states, create foundations for its own map, its own borders, its own structures, and its own bureaucracies, which eventually becomes extremely important in 1991. And the even more important factor is that for the first time ever, in 1922, the Russians get their own institutions and borders within the empire that separate them from the rest of the empire. The Russian borders before 1922 were always the imperial borders. Now there is a distinction between the empire, which is called the Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation, which in 1991 and 1990 produces the basis for Boris Yeltsin and others to mobilize and have their own parliament and declare that, okay, Russia is also independent. We are not responsible for what is happening in Georgia, what is happening in Armenia. It's the center, it's the union, it's Gorbachev. So, from that point of view, really, 1917, 1918 is a major turning point in the history of this disintegration of the idea of the big Russian nation, of separation within it. The new map emerges, the new borders emerges, the new bureaucracies emerge. And pro forma that was recognized by the Soviet Union for the entire period up to 1991. There was no question, whatever the repressions were, there were no question that Russians and Ukrainians were separate people, separate nations. They were entitled, because Ukraine was and Belarus were entitled for representation in the organization of the United Nations organization and so on and so forth. But now, fast forward to the events of 2013 and 2014, I counted Putin in his official pronouncement, said at least maybe a dozen times, Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. So we are having this basically situation, an attempt to go back to the pre-1917 thinking and pre-1917 conceptualization, and you basically know where this is coming from. Putin reads Dnipro. Solzhenitsyn is very much actually in continuation. He understands that Ukrainians are separate, but actually when you read his 1990 major work of how we should reconstruct Russia, Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians should be together. This is continuation of the same project. Forget about those Georgians, forget about Central Asia, let them go. This is empire. This is not the empire, this is the nation state. So again, the continuation of this pre-1917 idea is certainly in Solzhenitsyn, and today you can pick it up in Putin's pronouncements. But the project, otherwise called Ruskiy Mir, the Russian world, certainly you don't hear much about it in the last 50 years. It doesn't mean that it will not come back. Again, the ideas have a long history and live for a long period of time and come and disappear and come back again. But certainly the events, the tragic events in Ukraine of 2013, 2014, really were a continuation of that blow to the idea of the big Russian nation that started with the events of 1917. And again, I want to conclude my presentation by saying that again, this process of the configuring and reconfiguring what are the borders within the broader defined Slavic world, this is very much the story of the 20th century as a whole, and very much also a story that brings us and Czechs together in different ways, different capacities, in different roles, but still part of the same process. So I We'll stop here. And thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to answer your questions if I know answers to them. So be careful asking questions that you think I know answers to.